I'm Bruce Stiftel, Chair of the School of City and Regional Planning, and delighted to have you here tonight to listen to Bill Anderson, President of the American Planning Association and Vice President with AECOM out of San Diego. Bill's also the Director of Planning and Economics for the U.S. West for AECOM. He has a bachelor's from Claremont McKenna in Economics and Political Science and a master's in City Planning from Harvard. He was with Economic Research Associates for 23 years, did plans in 20 states and 8 foreign countries, and then for 5 years he was Planning Director of San Diego, California. And his City of Villages plan in San Diego was much vetted and awarded back in 2008. At APA, Bill was chair of the Economic Development Division. He was chair of the Diversity Task Force, co-chair of the Sustainable Places Initiative, and then a director for Region 6, which I assume is the West Coast.
And Western Europe.
And Western Europe.
Go figure, I don't know.
Looking up Bill's credentials, I saw an interview in which he said that some of his influential some of the people who've been influential in developing his ideas were Neil Pierce, Kevin Lynch, Donald Appleyard, and Jane Jacobs. As APA president, he has an agenda, or he campaigned on an agenda that was about advancing partnerships, and about partnerships at the local, regional, national level, but also international, and engaging people who are concerned about planning, but not familiar with the planning profession. Bill, the title of the talk is something we all want to know about, and we look forward to what you have to say. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Bruce. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to Georgia Tech. My uncle went to Georgia Tech, so my father went to Georgia. And my dad used to always tell me this story that, is the mic not working? There we go. Does that work? Okay. So you probably didn't hear the part that my dad went to Georgia. So he told me he started the great Georgia Tech fight of 1940. I guess it was a football game. Georgia won. There was a bell. He was ringing the bell. The Georgia Tech students came to stop the bell. They were fighting over the bell, and his fist slipped, and it started a 1940 fight. He never told me who won that. So anyway, so it's a pleasure to be back. Let me talk about planning, practice, and profession. This is one of those things everybody has an opinion about, who are in the profession, or who observe the profession, or work with us as planners, whether academics or professionals, or the citizen planner. And so these are just my thoughts from working in this field for 30 years in different places, but also as APA president the last couple of years, going around the country and speaking to the different chapters and learning about the planning issues in the different parts of the country and internationally at the World Urban Forum in Australia and the Royal Town Planning Institute. And there are some commonalities that are universal. But it was also interesting for me that my very first month as president, I spoke at the Alabama conference at the beginning of May and the Oregon conference at the end of May. And so in that first month, I did get to bracket the spectrum of planning, I think, in the US. Some of the major themes, this is not going to be new to you, but certainly climate change is a big one. In fact, in my opinion, it is the driving issue of the next century for planners, and how to deal with it and try to mitigate further erosion of the environment. This is particularly something that is driving planning from my state, where I'm from, California. A lot of planning right now is being driven by the state climate laws, AB 32 and SB 375, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 20% below 1990 levels and 50% below by 2040, 2050. and where every region now has to prepare a sustainable community strategy that demonstrates through their land use and transportation planning how they are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if they don't demonstrate it, they're challenged in court. Recognizing that, at least in our case in San Diego, half of the greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. We're a city that grew during the post-World War II, even though we're the oldest city in California. We grew during World War II, so very auto-oriented, trying to transition. But also electricity in the way we design our buildings. And for us, water. We import 85–90% of our water. That importation of water generates a lot of energy, or uses a lot of energy and greenhouse gas emissions. So every jurisdiction has to prepare a climate action plan that demonstrates how they are going to try to address these issues. Some are operational, some are related to planning. But now, looking at adaptation, the results of climate changing environment, whether it's rising sea levels, what's the appropriate time for intervening in certain engineering improvements or avoidance today, for habitat, for sea levels, for infrastructure, for our tourism industry and the beaches, but also with wildfires and other factors that influence our communities and put our communities at risk. And every community around the country is around the world is having these issues. It's the classic insurance problem. We know it's going to have to happen more often and perhaps more severely than in the past. We just don't know exactly when and where, at what time. And so a component that's one of the things that's coming out of this that's influencing planning, I think, positively and perhaps negatively, is the use of metrics to demonstrate if we're making progress, and planning to those metrics, analyzing and quantifying those metrics. And so the question is, as we get into more information technology, more data to monitor how we're doing in terms of our planning, and in this case to measure greenhouse gas emissions, but other metrics as well. They could be socioeconomic, the economy, they could be health metrics. Do we start planning to the numbers instead of, and what does that do in terms of creativity, especially from the design side? How do we marry the two? Also, the opportunity of looking at cities as resources, producers of clean energy. This building here, right here, Central Park in Sydney, is a new infill development at an old brewery site in Sydney. Green building, a heliostat that takes the sun and brings it down into the center. Uses gray water for most of their water. I think it recovers 80% of their energy through their own systems. Looking at how we build our buildings in our cities as producers of energy instead of relying on imported energies or fossil fuel sources of energy. But again, looking at metrics and monitoring how we do that. And from, I think, the implementation perspective, what's the cost-effective approach? Good example is on adaptation. If the rising sea levels are expected to grow exponentially and really become a problem 40, 50 years from now, it may not make sense to do something today, but wait till 10 years from now or 20 years from now with new technology, new materials at that point, to then make the investment. And from a present value perspective, wait instead of doing it today. But those are calculations that marry planning with engineering, with financial analysis, and that's influencing the practice. When we talk about this to the public, however, we can't be talking in terms of net present value or LEED grades or sustainability metrics, CO2 emissions. We need to be talking more simply the way they perceive their environment. Environment equals health, economy equals quality of jobs, and equity equals access. Access to opportunity. Not everybody's equal. We know the bell curve doesn't work that way. You know, we're at the top end of the bell curve thinking about long-range planning issues. I would guess we're mostly at the low end of the bell curve in terms of being a successful running back on a football team. The role of the comprehensive plan, and this is one of the things we were doing with Sustaining Places, is climate action plans were coming out there, all these different studies to deal with this issue of sustainability. And Bruce Knight, who was president a couple terms ago, said, you know, this is the role of the comprehensive plan. The comp plan, the general plan, is where we bring these issues together. The relationship of land use and transportation, environmental planning and habitat preservation, urban form and design, energy, resources. And the plans have legal authority in many states. And so they should be the vehicle for addressing these issues. And they should be looked upon by the electeds and the constituents as the vehicle for addressing issues. And maybe we're not doing the plans like we need to be doing to really get the public to accept them as the policy vehicle for addressing sustainability. Another major trend that's happening that's pretty exciting is healthy communities. And this was the lesson learned in my first month. In Alabama, where the planners understood the issues of sustainability, but they said, you know, our bosses, our electeds, won't let us talk about it. But they could talk about public health and healthy communities. And in Oregon, where they were driven by sustainability and environmental considerations, and their elected supported them, they were talking about the same things when they were down at the town level or the master plan level. Walkable communities, bikeable communities. And I think part of it is the tradition of the southern town versus what planners are trying to recreate in our cities that grew up post-World War II, that were auto-oriented and didn't have those rich town centers, the parks, the mixture of uses that you have in the older cities. So it's an opportunity for these to come together under healthy communities. It's a long tradition of planning. As you all know, planning got started really in many ways to deal with public health issues in the US. What's exciting about this trend is the public health community, which is much larger than the planning community and politically more powerful than the planning community, is very interested in what we do. So the Surgeon General spoke at our national conference here in Atlanta. We've had partnerships with the Center for Disease Control for over a decade. And in fact, we have a big announcement of something coming up soon with them, which is exciting. AARP was a sponsor of the Alabama conference, and they were engaged with us at the national conference. Because this whole notion of people living healthy by simply living is a terrific notion. Not having to join a club to be healthy, having access to good food, exercising by actually using their legs, not having to drive everywhere they go. So this is an emerging trend. It's been happening for the last 5 or 6 years, but it's really getting some momentum. And I think it's very exciting around the country, and it even came up in Medellin at the World Urban Forum. So we've been working with the CDC on the Planning and Community Health Research Center, looking at how general plans or comp plans around the country are dealing with these issues. There's an example in Riverside County, California, where the county health department, which is in the county jurisdiction, has a planner as the head of their Healthy Communities program. And they've passed a resolution, and are getting all the cities within the county to pass resolutions stating the value of healthy planning. And what's interesting about Riverside is it's a very auto-oriented County, sprawling area with a large Hispanic community. So the way they've been communicating healthy communities to them is through things like art and meetings in the neighborhood and other ways that just communicate the notion of family health. And that brings people who historically have not been engaged in our planning issues becoming engaged, not because they want to know what an FAR is or what form-based codes are, but they want to learn about, well, where I live, is that healthy? How can you help me make it more healthy for myself and my children? The other is the baby boomers. As we age, we're going to want to live in place or live in neighborhoods that we're familiar with. And so how do we design communities where people can do that? And that's why AARP is very interested in what we're doing. Some folks like Larry Frank from the University of British Columbia have been working with health data related to urban form data and then comparing the two and trying to build a predictive model that can look at what might be health metrics that come from not just socioeconomic characteristics of a neighborhood, but the physical form of a neighborhood. And then maybe use that to help influence decision makers and planners and the public on how to design their cities as we go forward. And he's been able to do that. San Diego was an example where the county received a $17 million grant from the Center for Disease Control to get down into real detailed health metrics at a neighborhood level. And then he was able to compare that with urban form and other characteristics. Other trend very much is the planning for economic prosperity. This is not new. We've been doing it for 100 years and longer. But there has been a perception, and we saw this during the recession, of attacking planning as planners are only concerned about regulation. And that planners and planning was thwarting economic development rather than supporting economic development. It's not just here in the US, it's happening in the UK, it's happening in Australia, it's happening in many other places. So it was important, we felt, to take on this challenge and remind first our members and then the general public that we have a rich tradition of planning for economic prosperity. And we should promote that and tell the stories. And look at planning as not just a discipline to prevent bad things from happening, but also as a discipline to make good things happen. When we look at the changing structure of our economy, this is a big issue for us in our cities, where our middle class was coming from manufacturing and continuing to shrink. Even if manufacturing continues to grow, it's not going to generate the employment that it used to with growing manufacturing. Growing employment in healthcare and social services, in lower wage leisure industries, technology and information, professional science and technology being a driver, but not supplying the volume of jobs that are necessary to support a growing middle class. And this is a concern that I think we're all going to be facing, even if we're in areas that are known as technology centers. Evidence of that impact has been in the income distribution in the US, where I think in 1980 we had about 31% of the income was in the bottom three quintiles, and now it's down to 24% and getting worse. What does that mean in terms of planning for affordable housing, planning access to jobs? What's our industrial base? How can we generate better jobs for 60% of our population? People are trying to do it though. In Mission Bay, San Francisco, one of the few new redevelopment areas in San Francisco, anchored by a biotech center in the University of San Francisco, also mixed-use residential. with inclusionary housing as a component of it. Kansas City being a Google city, trying to position itself as a tech center attracting new entrepreneurs and startup companies in the middle part of the country. Arlington, Virginia has done this a long time over the last couple decades in taking strip retail and creating with transit a new urban center. San Diego, we did this with our downtown. Even though San Diego's larger than Seattle, larger than San Francisco, it's the second largest city in California, larger than Denver, larger than many other cities, it's the 8th largest city in the country. We're too close to Los Angeles. So we aren't the financial center for our region of the country. And so consequently, we don't have the corporate headquarters that you may have in other cities of our size. The decision was made in the 1980s was, yeah, but we have an ocean. And let's make downtown a residential downtown and be an employment center for the region, for services and government in that area, but also for leisure. And the investment in amenities for leisure also attracts residents and vice versa. And so looking at your assets in different ways to position yourself as a lifestyle that attracts the young entrepreneurs who are looking for lifestyle, because now with technology they can live anywhere. Vancouver, BC, turning their downtown around into a global model for urbanization. But Pittsburgh lost 200,000 jobs with in the 1980s, rebranding and rebuilding itself through livability and quality, working with their university institutions, and in a beautiful natural setting that often people didn't see because of the pollution of the steel industry. Once things started to clear up, they could see that this is a beautiful spot. And where steel's even coming back now is high-end specialty steel. But the commonality of a lot of this is that it was anchored by innovation and continuing to anchor by innovation and looking at cities as generators of new ideas, new companies, new services, new technologies, people working together to innovate, whether it's at a big corporate scale or at a small startup scale, and a mixture of all of that. And there's a group in San Diego that's trying to do this in our eastern downtown area, East Village, and trying to position itself for creative industries like West Hollywood has, or the Design District in Miami. And I like their tagline. It's not sales per square foot that matters, it's ideas per square foot is their goal. But you do have the Dallases, and you do have other places that are growing because of logistics and trade and other types of industries, and then that creates the kind of population dynamics of growing population in a short amount of time, and how do we plan for that? But we also have we have the Detroits and the shrinking cities, and that's another major area that has, of course, been with us for a long time. That was one of the major issues when I was in graduate school, which is why my area is more in economic development, is this notion of the shrinking city. The St. Louis being the second largest city in the country in 1900. Detroit, a shadow of what its former greatness. How do they reinvent themselves? How do they reposition the city? How do they use that extra land? They often have great building stock, but much of it abandoned. Cleveland has taken on an interesting twist in this. We had the planning director of Cleveland made a presentation to us at the Big City Planning Directors Institute at Lincoln. And Robert, his very first picture of their new general plan of Cleveland was a cow. And we were kind of scratching our heads, a cow, Cleveland, we didn't get it. And he said that after 50 years of denial, of trying to be the Cleveland of old, they finally came to terms that they were not going to be the Cleveland of the 1950s. When they finally made that decision, it opened up all new possibilities. People were rethinking space, land use, the economy, and a lot of this extra land was being repurposed for agriculture, not community gardens, but commercial agriculture in the city, helping to fuel a farm-to-table infrastructure to support a lifestyle that attracts or retains the young talent and entrepreneurs in the growing industries. And one of the ones where they do have a very strong anchor, is the Cleveland Clinic, and where they're planning a transit system and biotech, biomed linked to that transit system, linked to the Cleveland Clinic. So making those connections. But anytime we do this, we do have to think about planning for all and access to the jobs, the transportation, education, healthy living, and decent affordable housing. This is one of the areas where in our region, San Diego, in the regional transportation plan, the transportation agency, the MPO, is also our Council of Governments, was criticized by many of the poor, lower income, working class communities. They said, you know, this regional transportation plan is interesting, but you're connecting us by transit to all the places that have low wage jobs. You're not connecting us to the places in the region where high wage jobs are being generated. We want to be connected to those as well. And so they've, from an economic justice perspective, are influencing the next update of the regional transportation plan to make those connections through a bus rapid transit system so that folks in those communities have choices of where to find employment that they can access by transit. Poverty inside the principal cities, looking at the 20 largest cities, I believe is this data, higher than the national average, lower in the suburbs. But let's not forget there's also a lot of poverty outside of the metropolitan areas, in the agricultural communities, rural communities of America. And so this is one of the things sometimes at APA we're criticized of thinking too much about cities and metropolitan areas and not enough about small towns and rural parts of the country. And this is an area too that we have to address. So when we look at it in terms of analysis, look at the distribution, whether it's distribution of minorities, distribution linguistically, for environmental and economic justice, and even access to mobility. Although this one's interesting because it's double-edged. This is San Francisco, and you can see these are the percentage of households in these probably census blocks that do not have a vehicle. In certain parts of the region, that might be a problem, and these are people who lack access. This is the financial district of San Francisco, some of the highest real estate in the country, highest valued real estate in the country. This is by choice for many people here. So look at your statistics and try to understand what's behind the numbers when looking at the spatial data. Major trend you've all heard about, I'm sure, is the changing face of America. That in a few decades will be a minority majority. There are currently 4 states in the country that are minority majority: California, New Mexico, Texas, and Hawaii, and District of Columbia as well. But the nation as a whole is going to be minority majority coming up. And with much of that growth projected to be from the Hispanic community and Asian community. What does it mean for us as planners? One is, how do we communicate with and get engaged different, more diverse populations? But also, I think it's incumbent upon us, and it's certainly in APA's mission, how to bring people together. And you have a great example here. I was impressed when I was here for the national conference and just walking through Olympic Park and seeing the diversity of people just having fun together and designing public spaces to bring people together. And I think that's another major trend. I mean, it's as long as the history of cities, but I think compared to the planned communities of the 1970s and the 1980s, where we had, you know, age-restricted communities or gated communities or large lot communities, wouldn't it be nice if we as planners and designers and we're able to convince our clients and our bosses, no, let's focus more on designing spaces that bring people together than keep them away from each other out of fear. Serving the aging population, the baby boom cohort going through life, and that's going to be upon us, well, it is now, and is going to continue to be for the next 3 or 4 decades. But it's not just an issue of more retired people going from, what, about 15% to 20% of the population, so increasing significantly, 10%, is that it's not just people who are in 65 to 70 that's growing, it's that they're growing, they're living longer. And so we're going to have more people who are in their 80s and 90s than we had in the past. How do people have productive lives? What do we as planners, what can we do to make sure people have happy, healthy, productive lives as they live throughout their life? And again, designing communities where people can age in place, age in their same neighborhood, be amongst families and friends and places that are familiar, can access services and health care without having to drive, because at some point they may not be able to drive, or they can walk. So that's incumbent upon us on how we design our cities, whatever the scale. It also has an implication for our economy. We're doing work right now in the AECOM part in Rochester, Minnesota, with the Mayo Clinic and the state of Minnesota on Destination Medical Center. Rochester's interesting if you don't know it. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of Minneapolis. It's a town of 100,000 people surrounded by agriculture and has one of the great medical institutions in the world with the Mayo Clinic. People from all over the world come to the Mayo Clinic for health care. One of the things they're facing in their market, which is not unusual, is that the population's aging, approaching retirement. The workforce population coming behind them is not nearly enough to fill those jobs. Yet they're continuing to grow because they're in the healthcare field. How do they attract people to fill those jobs, or make sure people don't leave because there's a lot, they need their young to stay in their communities for this employment. And so, and especially the Gen X, sometimes I get mixed it up, Gen X, right, the ones behind the baby boomers, the smaller cohort than the baby boomers. The millennials are larger, but they're still younger. They're not there yet to fill those roles, especially in management and some of the more senior positions. Probably we'll see more baby boomers working longer throughout their careers, some out of choice, some out of necessity. But this notion of where's the workforce coming from is a critical question for our economies in many places around the country. Shifting gears from Rochester, Minnesota to the globe, the other major planning issue that we certainly were reminded of at the World Urban Forum is the global population. And the global population going from 7 billion, a little more than 7 billion today, to 9 billion in about 25 years projected. But not just that, urbanization 40% today to 60% in about 25 years. And 25 years seems like a long time in the future, and maybe for some of the students here it is because you weren't born yet. But for those of us who are a little older, baby boomers, the 1990s actually weren't that long ago. It always seems longer when you look forward than when you look back. And this is a major change because that change takes that population of 3.3 billion people living in metropolitan areas to about 5.5 billion people, 2.2 billion more in 25 years. That's like, I calculated it the other night, that would be like building 285 New York cities somewhere around the world over the next 25 years. Or almost 400 or over 400 Atlanta metropolitan areas during that time. That is a lot of growth, and much of it is occurring in parts of the world that do not have the economic resources of a New York City or an Atlanta metropolitan area. You know about Asia and Latin America. Africa is the next one that's expected to. But do they have the resources to deal with the issues that come with rapid urbanization? So another new course is new towns and building new towns for this growing population. And rethinking infrastructure. How do you provide infrastructure for all of this new urbanization, but also the redevelopment of infrastructure in older cities in Europe and in the United States? And thinking about maybe we should do infrastructure differently than we had in the past. Some of it's big infrastructure. With these cities and transport and globalization is growing transport by air. So a whole other field is aerotropolis. And looking at the airport like we used to look at the train stations, the central train stations of cities, as being a center area of where the city comes together, particularly in newer towns, in emerging economies, and designing cities around them. Looking at technology and smart cities to be more efficient in how we use our resources and manage our resources so we don't have to build as much as we might because of changes in technology. And looking at placemaking, but also placemaking tied to transportation and transit and other modes of transportation, active transportation that is not as reliant on the automobile. And so as a place to bring people together. So for the practice, you all know where planners intervene. We help the public envision these things. And I joke, you know, when I'm at a Charger game, sometimes I'm thinking, okay, 70,000 people here in the stadium, how many people here know what city and regional planning is or what an urban planner does? You know, probably not many, probably a small percentage. But what percent know whether they live in a nice community or not, whether they have access to parks, the quality of the schools, how do they get to work, whether they have clean air or clean water? Probably 98%. So people are very familiar with the issues that we address as planners, and we can help them in that process of envisioning and knowing the right tools to do that. Research and analysis, plan making, standards, design and development, and public investments. But in the past, we've been looking at the way we've developed comprehensive plans is we've looked at trends and said, okay, well, project the trends. This is how much space we need. This is how we accommodate that space, whether it's through building volume or acreage, and this is where we're going to place it. And they used, as 20-year plans, used to hold a lot of things constant or assume they would be constant. Climate, supply of water, energy, technology, human health, hazards. But now, things move so much more quickly. Whether it's uncertainty and risk about the economy, being a global economy, or about the climate and its impacts, or technology. And so trying to think of plans now as maybe a new type of plan that is more adaptive, a type of plan that can respond quickly to changes, which means maybe we don't get as detailed in our plans as we used to get because we have to have that flexibility to adapt to changes without having to amend a whole general plan. Another thing is looking at the different scales of planning and how they can be integrated to have a sustainable system. This is something that David Gottschalk and I, when on the Sustaining Places Task Force, looked at was the notion of what's the appropriate scale of planning for the issue. So to have a truly sustainable system, we have this issue where resources are regional, whether it's habitat, air, water, the labor force, the economy, mobility, but demand decisions are local. How do you reconcile those two? And so having a regional framework that deals with those issues that are regional, habitat systems, air and water quality. And then within regions, you may have a county plan. And within a county, you may have a rural portion of the county and a city portion or urban portions of the county. And then within the cities, you have various communities or neighborhoods. And then within those communities and neighborhoods, you may have sites for master plans, or you may have parcels. Finding that scale of planning and the appropriate policy approach for those scales that are then vertically integrated creates a strong system of planning. But knowing when not to go too far. At the regional scale, we shouldn't be talking about sidewalk widths. At the master planning level, we should be talking about sidewalk widths, but maybe not habitat systems. But if we have a habitat system going through our neighborhood, we should be consistent with that regional goal. And so making sure that we look at those different scales and how they come together. I'll give you an example from San Diego where I'm familiar. Just so if you don't know San Diego is a city of 1.3 million people in a county of 3.2 million people in a binational metropolitan area with northern Baja of about 5.5 to 6 million people. So it's the second largest city in California. I say we're south of Southern California. We're proud that we're not part of LA. We're also the most biodiverse county in the continental United States. And geographically, the county is about the size of Connecticut or Western Massachusetts. So it's fairly large geographically. So we start our planning with the green space. And our green spaces are topography and our habitat systems. And while we don't have an urban limit line like Oregon, we do have a water service line that functions in many ways as an urban limit line. But our habitat areas aren't just outside the urban limit line, they are fully integrated into the river valleys and estuaries to the ocean habitats. And this is something Lynch and Appleyard, Kevin Lynch and Donald Appleyard, brought to us as the notion in the 1970s. It's influenced planning since. So we start with the green space, and then we look, okay, well, this is what we're going to protect. Where are we going to grow in the future? And so looking at the different areas of growth that are outside these habitat areas, and then planning a transportation system along them and looking at where development can grow, either new village centers or existing village urban areas that would then expand. And looking at these different place types, whether they're rural village or the downtown metro center or something in between, whether it's a community Main Street district or a sub-regional urban center. And then organizing those. And with that, organizing our transportation system and investments, looking at transit and BRT, light rail, heavy rail, as well as active transportation and biking for circulation. And when looking at that, we look at choices. To create markets, you have to have choices. People respond to choices of mobility. People respond to choices of housing and where to live. When you have choices, there's a greater chance you can find some type of equilibrium. People at different stages of their lives or economic outlooks can find what fits best for them. But we as planners have to provide those choices. If we don't, we're not giving them what they need to find what's best for their situation. So within the city of San Diego, so we took that region as habitat and where growth would occur. And then in the city of San Diego, identified, okay, within our area, what are the areas conducive for that future growth? We're projected to grow by another 400,000, 500,000 over the next 30 years. Where's that going to go? And so this village propensity map overlaid different attributes that would be conducive to walking, biking, access to transit, access to jobs, opportunities for infill development because of ownership, and identified those areas. But the city itself being 330 square miles, we couldn't be planning like a suburb what you're doing in each of your particular neighborhoods and parcels. So we have community plans. And the community plans really get into what are the bones of that community, what are the activity centers, what are the districts that, and the urban design that fits for that particular community, what are the amenities. So we went from region to city to community. And then within the community, we may have a master plan. And in this case, in Uptown, it was the old Sears site that was redeveloped into a mixed-use urban center on about 14 acres. Near Balboa Park, near downtown, near the bay, with bus transit connected to it, and now a bike system. And in the process now, when we do community plans, looking at health metrics to try to plan a healthier community as we plan these. And when we plan for health, we also have to plan for fiscal health for a city, which gets into how are we going to pay for these things. And this is something we see in a lot of communities, is their general plan standards, if they were ever to build them out, there's no way they could afford them. So why set that up where you set up, especially if you have impact fees and a financing mechanism tied to them, raising expectations that aren't warranted, and look at really what is the situation that the taxpayers are willing to pay for. Plan for sustainability and resiliency, looking at multiple functions for our public facilities, and leveraging those public investments. This here is an example in San Francisco where the high-speed rail station is planned. And what they plan on top of the high-speed rail station is an urban park. Now, to pay for this urban park, they know that's going to add value to these properties that are adjacent to it and being near the high-speed rail station. So they've conditioned that you can build here right now. If you want to build all this, you have to agree to participate in a special tax district that will help finance. And so it's making those kinds of linkages of urban design and landscape architecture with transportation, with finance and fiscal policy. This one is in Idaho Falls, small town in Idaho, where they had their chapter conference. And it's a dam, hydroelectric, provides something like 70% of their electricity in this town of about 100,000 people. It's also a place to fish. They have a green belt. It's the center of their downtown. They have a nice little main street downtown next to it. They attract visitors to it. Same notion of leveraging public facilities as a practical purpose for other uses and amenities. This was done in the 1920s. So it's not a new idea. And so it's just trying to do more of that as we look at our public facilities. And so plan and think about planning as something to build and capture value as we introduce amenities and design for value building, whether it's private value or public value. And then use that value and capture some of it back to help finance the resources. Vancouver, British Columbia has been very aggressive in doing this for building their downtown. With this, it means planning for vision and inspiration is still important. The big ideas do still inspire. They inspire the public, they inspire just people, they inspire the business community and entrepreneurs, the people who can decide, where do I raise my family to have my startup business? Is it going to be in the Bay Area, in Portland, in Seattle, in North Carolina, in Atlanta, Chicago, San Diego, Denver, Austin? It could be in many different places these days. So that quality of life becomes an important part of not just the purpose of living, but also for economic development and making those linkages. So design still matters and is very much important part of the formula. But we do need to show how that results in economic outcomes. Whether it's public investment, such as in downtown San Diego with recreating a downtown as an urban community, or if it's Charleston, South Carolina, using historic resources and preservation for creating that value. There are different ways to skin a city, find the right way that is appropriate for the location. So this is my last slide, and it's about the profession, but maybe during questions there'll be more on this. What does this mean for the profession, according to Bill Anderson, who's up here today? One is the profession is increasingly multidisciplinary. I think there was a period there where our profession, the design professions, landscape architects, when I was planning director, I tried to create an urban form division. And I said, okay, well, I need an architect, and I need a landscape architect, and I need an urban designer to referee between the two to create this division. Having that integration with also the engineers, the economists, the finance people, the political ramifications of planning and to get things done. It's becoming increasingly multidisciplinary, so embrace that. Get to know the other disciplines and how they relate to your discipline. Learn how to communicate your discipline to others and how what you do helps them do what they do, which means collaborate. And it's collaborating within the profession, but also collaborating with the public. And like I say, in planning is not something that should happen to people, it's something that should happen with people. So make sure they're part of that engagement. So professional collaboration and public collaboration. The other is this analysis and creativity. It's both coming together. And sometimes we get a little too technical, or sometimes we create creative plans that could never be implemented. Marry those two together. Use both sides of the brain to do that, or have a team that has both sides of the brain to come together. And that certainly is the way the profession's going. This one's the public-private, public-private, public-private. I was talking to Bruce about this. I think in my generation, maybe before, people tended to pick, I'm going to be a public sector planner or I'm going to be a private sector planner pretty early on. And it maybe had to do with the, once you're vested in the public sector, the benefits were pretty good, and it was hard to, every year you stayed, that just improved the benefits more. And APA, 70% of our members are public sector planners. But the private sector is growing faster than the public sector amongst the younger planners. Planners in both sectors would benefit from having experience in both sectors. And so look for those opportunities to go back and forth. Or if you're a public sector planner that you're young and right now you're working behind the counter reviewing plans, and you're not doing the great inspirational things you learned about in school, satisfy that outlet through activism and other means outside of your job. Or the private sector planner, if you're working for developers that just build strip shopping centers, get involved with the Community Development Corporation to satisfy that aspect of what you do. That experience will help over the course of a career. The other is planners and designers as entrepreneurs. This is something we've seen in San Diego that was interesting in the 70s and 80s, kind of like maybe Dallas is today or Phoenix. We were really a city where the development industry was driven by the merchant builders, building planned communities in the suburbs. Very powerful politically. Consequently, the public reacted. We had what we called the growth management wars and ended up with a growth management system. But what's evolved since then, as the city has gotten to the point where there are no more green fields to develop and everything's urban infill, is the architectural schools in the region are teaching designers to be developers. So it's to build on their own account. And they're doing a lot of interesting smaller scale infill development in the neighborhoods. But because they're designers, they're thinking about context, they're thinking about architecture, they're thinking of the value that's created with design and working at that scale, working with the community. So it's looking at entrepreneurs. From the public sector perspective, resources are diminishing for planning. We have to be more creative in how we implement our plans. Can't rely on that big federal dollar coming in or a big tax measure by the voters. And so that notion of leveraging other public facilities, private investment, public investment to achieve what we want to achieve becomes important. And then lastly, this is true with the economy, it's also true with planning. Because of information technology, the local innovation becomes global ideas pretty quickly. And that applies to planning too. Whether it's the BRT system, and now being used throughout the US, popularized in Latin America and Brisbane, Australia. According to Paul Farmer, started here in Pittsburgh, but I'm not sure if that's true. That back and forth, because that planner at the desk in Wichita can now find out how do they address the issues he or she's working with in the Netherlands or in Melbourne or in Bogota. And APA is doing more with our international partners to provide that kind of outlet. So with that, that's the world according to Bill, and be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
We have time for questions. If you raise your hand, Jesse and I will bring a microphone to you. Who's first?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Brody. I'm an alumna of this program, but also now I'm at Civil Engineering under my PhD. And I really liked your framework of the different scales of the plans.
Mm-hmm.
What I was wondering is, in terms of kind of finding co-benefits between those plans and different master plans maybe, or citywide plans within the regional plan, how do they work together and how would they kind of integrate both visions and implementations within that region?
Yeah, there are various models. I mean, there are a few models that have state plans. I think Hawaii's one. Actually, some folks here in the room might know better than I. That regional agency has to approve what the local government is doing in order to approve the plan. California Coastal Commission might be an example in the coastal zone in California. But that's rare. In most places, local governments still have land use control, and that's very protected. They won't give it up to the regional agency. So the regional agency then has to become a consensus-building organization and coordination, and get the public engaged too, so that there's a plan, so the communities agree to participate and be part of that and be guided by that regional plan. Some of the agencies, their key strength comes, besides this influence and coordination, is the purse for transportation in particular. Say, okay, well, if you want regional transportation dollars, you have to demonstrate that you're being consistent or helping to further the regional plan. Or let's say habitat dollars or whatever the public facility you're talking about. But I mean, even in London right now, the Conservative government got rid of regional planning agencies there, and they were famous for it. So I think a system where you have more of the regional plan is built with the local communities, a process for consensus decision making, which is a very structured and sometimes slow process, and then tied with regional dollars that help induce or provide an incentive for local governments to do things that are consistent, combined with a lawsuit every once in a while. Can get you much of the way there. But that's going to vary by state, by the way.
Who's next?
Hi, Bill. Misha
Hi.
Goshway, faculty member here in the planning department, planning school. I do a fair amount of work in health impact assessment, and I'm interested in getting your perspective on what you're hearing from practicing planners about the opportunities and barriers for them to
be able to do more health impact assessment work in their areas?
Part of the problem is data and accessing the data from the the public health agencies, often a county agency. They're very protective of the data and how it might be used. I think sometimes there's this notion of some communities don't want to hear how poorly they're doing, right? And so they don't get the political support to do the analysis. And when I was in the city, we were trying to create a system of, we called it leading community economic indicators that included some health metrics, but economics and social indicators as well. And we were talking to the Urban Institute, and they told us about their program nationally. And it was interesting. I think they had like 25 examples. 2/3 were developed by non-government entities because they had the freedom to call it as they saw it. While if it was in a government, either it may or may not get the support of the electeds, they may not want to hear it, or if it becomes public, their constituents will blame the elected, and they don't want that. So often, and during tight budget times, it might be one of the things that's cut. And what's important for that kind of system, whether it's health or sustainability or economics, is having some consistency and continuity in collecting and analyzing the data over time so you can see if you're progressing or not. And so I think that would be one of the major challenges. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mike Dobbins. I teach here as well. Two questions. One, you mentioned rather briefly the 3 E's,
yeah.
Equity, economy, and environment. And it strikes me over the last 4, 5, 6 years since the so-called recovery from the recession that the equity side of this is really at the bottom of the heap. And, have flat wages for most people or even dropping wages for the last 35, 40 years. And I don't really see the emphasis on trying to redress the equity issue that I think is necessary for a sustainable future. We all know that the Brundtland Commission report that the UN prepared in 1987 equated social equity with environmental stewardship. And we haven't done that as a profession. That's one question. The second, somewhat related question is, this is one of my 40 or 50-year rants. We don't pay any attention to education, public education as a driver of spatial patterns. The profession simply, it isn't on our radar.
Yeah. Okay. On the latter point first, on the education, I think you're absolutely right. And we talk about the millennials liking urban living more, wanting to live in compact, walkable communities, smaller spaces. I think the question we ask ourselves is, when they start having children, will they continue to do that? Because I anecdotally know many of my friends who grew up, or who lived in the bungalow communities, loved them. But when they start having children, they moved not because they wanted to, they moved for their kids, for the schools in the suburbs. And so I'm on the California Planning Roundtable, and one of the points we've been discussing is if the state of California is serious about trying to implement these sustainable community strategies and grow through urban infill near transit, then they have to make urban schools a priority for the state and the quality of the urban schools to do that. So people would stay or not feel compelled to leave because of the quality of the schools. So there's a direct link. And you talk to any real estate developer or broker, they'll tell you in a minute. And then the first point on equity, was a year and a half ago, I was invited to participate in a weekend forum at University of Michigan. And they were discussing, is there enough attention paid to social equity? And they were wondering if sustainability and social equity were consistent. Because they felt that often seeing the focus being on environmental, and many environmental advocates advocating for solutions that did not provide the kind of housing opportunities or affordability opportunities, or even thinking about the issues associated with social equity. I've found that in some cities you may have it coming from the city government. In most cities you may not, other than a couple of electeds, but as a whole you may not. So consequently, at a staff level, you can only go so far. Working with private developers, those that are focused on it and build affordable housing and workforce housing definitely would be there, but most commercial developers aren't. So where I found that there's been more awareness is in areas where you've had NGOs take it on as being the conscience for the metropolitan area, and being aggressive, willing to sue on environmental justice or compliance with environmental justice laws for projects that use federal dollars, looking and measuring and reporting out health impacts in neighborhoods, and making sure that's publicized. And so in San Diego, there's a group called the Environmental Health Coalition. It's very focused on the barrio communities that are near the port and near transit, and or near truck traffic. And so to me, you have to have those NGOs in place to really get that issue addressed.
Bill, I like your comments about public-private, and students leave here and they want the best job. They think they need the perfect job when they start out working. Can you talk a little bit about going from ERA to public sector back to ACOM? How did you do that?
Okay.
Obviously worked out great.
Yeah. Well, with ERA, I started off in the Boston office and worked on my first project was the Third Harbor Tunnel, socioeconomic impact of the Third Harbor Tunnel, which turned out to be the Ted Williams Tunnel, part of the Big Dig. And I'd never gone back to see if our estimates were right, but it was very much number crunching and analysis, and early on you're just absorbing. But one of the things about working with a consulting firm, a small consulting firm especially, is every year was like a different job, because I would have 4 or 5 different projects of different types in different parts of the country. But the frustration was you were focused on a particular aspect of a broad planning initiative going on. In my case, it was the urban economics. And so transferred to West Hollywood and then to San Diego. And to satisfy that, I got engaged with an NGO in San Diego called C3. There was a public advocacy group for planning, kind of like Spur in San Francisco as well. And so that helped satisfy, and met a lot of great people, and got a broader perspective on planning. And then also at ERA worked on multidisciplinary teams. So even though I wasn't trained in design, I can't draw, but I worked a lot with folks from EDA, Sasaki, WRT, and learned a lot about design through them and collaborating through them. And they learned a little bit, I hope, about urban economics and the importance of market feasibility. So that kind of collaboration was really important. While I was at ERA, and after this C3, I was president of this NGO, the mayor asked me to be on the planning commission. So I got to sit on the planning commission reviewing proposals for plan amendments and the general plan and all of that. Later became chair of the planning commission. And that's when we did our strategic framework, the City of Villages strategy for San Diego. So I got very engaged in public policy, which was nice because my degree, where I went to planning school at Harvard, was at the Kennedy, when it was at the Kennedy School. So I came from a public policy perspective on planning. And so that helped satisfy that. When Gail Goldberg became planning director of LA, the new mayor asked me to be planning director, so I came in, but I said only if it includes economic development, redevelopment, facilities, financing. I wanted the tools to not just plan, but to implement plans. And so we did that. And there the satisfaction is working in a context where you see it, you're involved from the conception of a plan to the implementation. And that's the nice thing about being at a public agency. You get to, for a few years, focus on a certain geography or for a certain city and the issues. And if you're in the right position, you get involved in every stage of that, and then can see how early decisions influence later outcomes. And so that's all helpful. When I left and got back into consulting with AECOM, now working on comprehensive plans for AECOM, not just the economics, that experience I had at the public agency has been invaluable for me to apply now professionally. And again, I'm traveling around working in different contexts and seeing how planning's applied in different parts of the country. So don't look, for the students out there, don't look at your first job as, this is it. Just
take time for one more question, and then perhaps others can bring questions to Bill up front after we conclude the session.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm first year in CRP, so excuse me if my questions seem a little naive. So bringing together a couple of these questions, particularly the notion of private and public, and then this issue of equity. From what I can tell, there seems to be a lot of emphasis in the private and sort of focusing on these projects that can get done because the money's there, there's market feasibility, and then the NGOs. What role does the public sort of realm play? I mean, do you see it worth the energies of planners to get involved in legislative fights, for example?
Oh yeah.
Indianapolis, right, where I'm from.
Okay.
The plans are great. Everyone seems to be publicly on board with the transportation upgrade, but the city government and the regional sort of counties around there have blocked it by saying that you can't raise any money for rail. Is it worth to get into those fights, or is that something that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and persistence, because many of the great planning initiatives around the country and examples didn't just happen off the bat. There were a few losses before it gained popularity to get the support to make it happen. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's an urban designer in Vancouver, and Vancouver has such a planning culture there. In fact, they export it. It's an export industry for Vancouver. And in my hotel room, there was a brochure about planning in Vancouver. That's the only time I've seen one in a hotel. I asked him about it, and he said the public sees planning as so important. There are constituents out there, they actually pick candidates to run, and they have what might be the equivalent of a PAC, political action committee, that's focused on getting the right people who make these decisions in the right position within city government to make the decisions. And so they don't just plan, wait for everyone to come along, and then be frustrated when they don't. They're very proactive. And sometimes it just takes persistence over decades, but the more people you have on board, eventually that will happen. Because the ideas are good, right?
Well, thank you so much for making time to stop and talk with us, and all the best with your agenda at APA.
Oh, thank you. Thanks again.